I was standing at the kitchen counter in my mother-in-law's house, pouring myself a glass of water, when my husband walked in with his parents behind him and told me I needed to find somewhere else to live. Not asked, told. He didn't look at me when he said it. He looked somewhere past my left shoulder, the way he always did when he'd already made a decision with his mother and just needed to deliver it. I set the glass down. The tap was still running. I turned it off. That small, stupid detail, the sound of water stopping, is what I remember most clearly about that moment, even now. "We've been talking," he said, "and we think it's best if you move out while we work things through. Mom and Dad are going to help me get back on my feet. There isn't really room for two households under one roof." His mother, standing slightly behind him, had the expression of someone trying very hard not to smile. I looked at my husband. At the man I had been with for 6 years, married to for 4, the man whose $47,000 in student loan debt I had helped pay down, whose car insurance I had covered for 3 years because his credit score couldn't get him a reasonable rate, whose share of our joint mortgage I had quietly carried for 11 months when he lost his job and couldn't find another one fast enough to matter. What none of them knew, what not a single person in that kitchen knew except me, was that the house we were all standing in, the house my mother-in-law was so comfortable making decisions about, was not in my husband's name. It was not in his parents' name. The mortgage, the title, the legal ownership of every room, including the kitchen I was currently being told to leave, all of it was mine, had been mine from the beginning. Because I was the one with the credit history to qualify. I was the one who had made every single payment. And I was the one whose name was on the deed. But I didn't say any of that. I just nodded, thanked them for letting me know, and went upstairs to think. I need to go back a few years, because what happened in that kitchen didn't start there. It started much earlier, in a version of my life I had spent a long time trying to build carefully, and a shorter time watching someone else quietly dismantle. My name is Sloane. I'm 34 years old. I grew up in Guelph, Ontario, in a pretty ordinary household. 2 parents, 1 younger sister, a dog that outlived the marriage. My mother went back to school when I was 12 and became a bookkeeper. My father drove long haul until his knees gave out, and he switched to dispatching. Neither of them had much to spare, but they were methodical people. They paid their bills on time. They kept a small savings account. They showed me, without making a lesson of it, that money was something you took seriously or it would take something from you. I took that seriously. I got into accounting at the University of Guelph, worked at a firm in Kitchener after graduation, moved to a mid-sized company in Mississauga when I was 26, and by 29 I was making decent enough money to start thinking about property. Not rich. Not investment portfolio money. But solid, steady documented income with a clean credit file and no debt except a small OSAP balance I'd cleared by 27. I met my husband through mutual friends at a long weekend in Muskoka. He was funny in a way that felt effortless, which I later understood was because he'd had a lot of practice charming his way through situations that required more than charm. He was 31, worked in sales, told me about a business idea he was developing on the side. The business idea changed every few months, which I noticed but told myself was just someone still figuring things out. I had been figuring things out at 25 too. We moved in together in a rental in Oakville. I covered more than half the rent because he was between commissions. That arrangement lasted longer than the between commissions part, but by then we had also built a life that felt real. Dinners with friends, a routine, a dog we adopted from the Humane Society, named after a hockey player I can't name without feeling something complicated. When we got engaged, his parents threw a dinner party in Brampton to celebrate. His mother hugged me and said she was so happy her son had found someone grounded. His father shook my hand and said I was clearly the sensible one. I thought that was a compliment. I understand now it was a job description. We started looking at houses in Hamilton in 2020. The market was already punishing and getting worse. His income was inconsistent enough that when we went to the bank, the mortgage pre-approval came back in my name only. He was on the application, but the qualifying income was mine. The approval was mine. The bank's interest in my financial history was not shared by my husband, who made a joke about it that everyone laughed at, and I did too because that was easier. We bought a semi-detached on the east end of Hamilton. Not flashy, not enormous, but ours. 3 bedrooms, a backyard that needed work. A kitchen with better bones than the previous owners had given it credit for. I signed the papers. I wrote the deposit check. My name went on the title as the primary owner. My husband was listed as a cohabiting spouse, which in Ontario carries certain rights but is not the same as being on the deed. That distinction mattered more than either of us knew at the time. The first year of marriage was fine. The second year was fine in the way that a load-bearing wall looks fine until you take a closer look at the foundation. He lost his sales job in the spring of 2022. He was home for 4 months, then found something in digital marketing that paid less and suited him worse. He was stressed. I was also stressed, but my stress was quieter and happened mostly in spreadsheets at 10 o'clock at night. What changed wasn't one big thing. It was the accumulation of small things that I kept not making a big deal of. Until one day I looked at the sum of everything I had not made a big deal of, and understood that I had been constructing something very different from what I thought I was building. He stopped contributing to the mortgage in month 8 of the digital marketing job. He said it was temporary. I said okay. I had said okay so many times by then that the word had stopped having shape. His parents started coming around more. His mother had opinions about the kitchen, the paint color I had chosen, the backsplash I had installed with my sister over a long weekend in November. She would stand in front of it with the particular silence of a woman who has decided not to say something out loud and is making sure you know that. His father watched hockey in the living room and left his dishes on the counter above the dishwasher, not in it. I worked from home 3 days a week. The house was not quiet those days. It was his mother's voice, his father's television, the creeping sense that I was a guest in my own square footage. I want to be clear about something. I do not think my in-laws are evil. I think they are people who loved their son in a way that never required him to figure very much out for himself, and they did not notice the cost of that love because someone else was always picking it up. That someone had recently become me. Things ended the way things like this usually end, not with a single catastrophic event, but with a conversation that finally said out loud what had been true for a while. He told me, in our bedroom on a Tuesday in October, that he wasn't sure the marriage was working, that he felt like he couldn't be himself, that he thought we wanted different things. I asked him what he wanted. He said he wasn't sure. I asked him what being himself meant, in practical terms. He didn't have a precise answer for that either. What he did have, I found out 3 days later, was a woman from his current office he had been texting since August. I didn't yell. I didn't throw anything. I sat on the edge of the bed and felt something that I can only describe as the very specific sadness of watching something you built get treated like it was never yours. I called my sister that night. She drove from Guelph, arrived at midnight, made tea, and sat with me until 2 in the morning. She asked me what I was going to do. I told her I wasn't sure yet, but I knew one thing. The house was mine, and whatever happened next was going to start from that fact. He moved into his parents' place in Brampton while we figured out next steps. I thought that meant lawyers and timelines, and the slow, painful logistics of unwinding a shared life. What I did not anticipate was that his parents, emboldened by his presence in their house, and perhaps by the story he had been telling them about me, would decide that the next step was me vacating the property. Which brings me back to that kitchen. Which brings me back to the tap water and the way he looked past my shoulder and his mother's expression. I had given myself one night to feel everything I needed to feel. The next morning, I drove to my family lawyer's office in downtown Hamilton. I had kept her from a previous tenant dispute, which turned out to be excellent foresight, and I sat across from her and laid out the facts. She already knew about the deed. We had spoken briefly when the separation started, but I told her about the kitchen conversation, about being told to leave, about his parents, acting as though the house was an asset of my husband's that I was merely occupying. She looked at me for a moment and then said, very evenly, "Sloane, they cannot make you leave. You are the registered owner of that property. Your husband has no ownership interest. He has no right to ask you to vacate, and his parents have even less." I said I knew that. She said, "I want to make sure you really know that, because people in your situation sometimes leave anyway because the social pressure is unbearable, and leaving voluntarily could complicate things later." I told her I had no intention of leaving voluntarily. What happened in the next few weeks was something I had not fully planned for, because I am someone who plans for things, and the chaos of the unplanned has always unsettled me. My mother-in-law called me twice, once to tell me that I was being unreasonable, once to tell me that her son's was in pain, as though I had not also been a person who had experienced pain during the preceding several months. My husband's brother, a man named after a prime minister I cannot mention without the conversation becoming a whole other thing, called me to suggest a family conversation, a sit-down, where cooler heads might prevail. I listened to all of it. I did not yell. I did not cry on the phone, which took more out of me than I'd like to admit. I said the same thing each time, calmly and without additional decoration. The house belongs to me. The mortgage is in my name. I have the documentation, and I have a lawyer. My husband called on the fifth day. He said his mother had been upset. I said I understood. He said he didn't think any of this needed to get legalistic. I asked him what alternative he had in mind. He said maybe I could find a short-term rental while we sorted things out. I said, and I meant this, not as a performance, but as the only honest response available to me. You are asking me to leave my own home. I need you to actually hear what you're asking. He didn't have an answer. In my experience, that particular silence is what happens when someone who has spent years being accommodated by the people around them is confronted for perhaps the first time with the actual weight of what they're requesting. I went back to the house on day 7. Not because I had ever actually planned to leave, but because I had spent a week staying with my sister, and I was done removing myself from the space I had purchased, maintained, and legally owned for 4 years. My mother-in-law was there when I arrived. She had been over often enough that she had a spare key, which was something I intended to address immediately. She looked at me the way she had always looked at me when reality wasn't cooperating with her preferred version of events. Not with anger exactly, but with a kind of offended bewilderment, as though my continued existence as a legal owner of the property was a clerical error someone should correct. I sat down at the kitchen table, the same table where 2 weeks earlier I had been told to find somewhere else to live. I put my bag on the chair next to me. I looked at her and I said, very quietly, "I'd like the spare key back, please." She stared at me. "This is my home," I said. "I've never stopped it being my home. I'm not asking for anything unusual. I'd like the key back." She gave it to me. I don't know if she'd expected me to have turned into a different person in the 2 weeks I'd been gone. Someone easier to manage, someone reduced. Whatever she'd expected, what she got instead was someone who had spent 7 days getting very clear about what she was, and wasn't willing to accept going forward. I told her, not unkindly, that I understood she was going through something difficult too, that watching her son's marriage struggle was painful, that I had no interest in making any of this harder than it needed to be. But I also told her that the decisions about this property were mine to make. And that included who had a key, who visited, and what the timeline of everything looked like. Those decisions were not going to be made in her son's childhood bedroom in Brampton. She left. She didn't say much. People who are accustomed to occupying space in a situation sometimes don't have a lot to say when the terms of that occupancy are renegotiated calmly and clearly. My husband and I went through mediation over the following months. I'm not going to pretend it was easy. Legally, as the non-titled spouse, he did have some rights. Ontario family law treats the matrimonial home differently than other property, which my lawyer had explained to me early and which I had prepared for. He was entitled to an equalization payment for the time we had shared the home, calculated based on the value appreciation during our marriage and what each party had contributed. That process was methodical and uncomfortable and cost both of us money we would rather have kept. But here's what did not happen. I did not leave my own house. I did not allow other people to make decisions about my property from someone else's kitchen table. I did not let the social pressure of being the difficult one, the one who wouldn't just be flexible, who kept making things legalistic, move me out of a home I had spent years building. My husband moved into an apartment in Stony Creek. It's fine, from what I understand, he's managing. His parents stopped coming around, which was a natural consequence of the fact that their son no longer lived here, and I had not invited them. My sister stayed with me for a month during the worst of it. She repainted the front hallway with me on a Sunday in January, a color my mother-in-law had once described as too bold for this neighborhood, which, in retrospect, should have told me everything. I chose it again, intentionally, from the same paint chip I had picked 3 years ago. I want to say something about the word grounded, because my mother-in-law used it at that engagement party, and his father repeated it, and I've thought about it a lot since. I think what they meant when they said I was the grounded one was that they were relieved someone would be managing the parts of life their son found difficult to manage. The bills, the documents, the things that require sustained attention. I think they saw that as a permanent arrangement and were confused, and then angry when I turned out to have a perspective on that arrangement. I'm not angry at them for it, exactly. But I'm done being grateful for a job I never applied for. The house is quiet in the mornings now. I sit at the kitchen table with my coffee, and it's always the right temperature because I'm the only one setting the pace. My dog, who did not go anywhere because the dog was mine, puts his chin on my knee and we both look out the window at the backyard, which I have been slowly turning into something worth looking at. My sister texted me last week to ask how I was doing. I told her I was okay. She said she was glad. Then she sent a follow-up that said, "You know what I keep thinking about? You never once acted like you were going to lose, even when it was bad." I thought about that for a long time before I answered. I think what she was noticing wasn't confidence exactly. It was something quieter and harder to name. It was the feeling of a person who finally stopped waiting for other people to acknowledge what she had built and understood instead, that the acknowledgement she'd been waiting for was the one that could only come from herself. The mortgage gets paid on the first of every month. My name is on the statement. The backyard is going to look good this summer. I'm already planning what to plant.